Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the preview to the ClassicsToday.com subscriber special video of the 10 best recordings of Le Maître himself, the master, Pierre Monteux. And this is a topic that I've really been enjoying thinking about, and I enjoy talking about it because I've done it before in a wider context. But specifically with respect to Pierre Monteux, what a fascinating character we're dealing with. If you are not a ClassicsToday.com subscriber, I'm sure you'll want to be. So there's information on where to sign up right below this video. We have both monthly and annual plans now you can pick. Oh, it's so exciting. I can't even begin to tell you. And here is the deal with Monteux and what makes him, for me, so fascinating. He was born in 1875. 1875. He died in 1964. And he was active until the very end of his life. So he lived to make a whole slew of wonderful stereo recordings of works that he knew from his childhood. He was at the premiere of the Franck Symphony in D minor in 1888. He gave the first performances of Stravinsky's Petrushka and The Rite of Spring and Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. Pieces that are 20th century classics. And he lived long enough to record many of these things in stereo. Not all of them will be in my list of his 10 best recordings, but for our purposes in this discussion, that doesn't matter. What matters is that he's lived long enough to basically show us how it was done, or how it should be done, or how he did it, however you want to slice it up. But what makes it so fascinating for me is that we have today these wannabe period instrument historical performance experts performing all of this repertoire that Monteux premiered. And he recorded them gloriously in fabulous stereo sound with modern orchestras. He was perfectly happy with how those orchestras sounded. He did not tell them to stop using vibrato. He did not tell them they had to use funky little instruments because they had funky little instruments in the 1880s or 1890s when he was a kid growing up or just learning his profession. He was a violinist, actually. He played Brahms string quartets for Brahms, who was impressed. If anybody knew what this music is supposed to sound like, it was conductors like Monteux. But conductors like Monteux were more than happy to train and work with modern symphony orchestras, playing modern instruments according to modern techniques, and they were thrilled. They never said a word about their style being wrong, or that it had to be done this way, or that my instruments sounded that way. So what do you think a conductor like Monteux would have said to the period instrument folks when they said to him, oh no, the Franck Symphony has to be played this way, or the Rite of Spring can only be played with these instruments? You know exactly what he would have done. And that raises a very interesting aesthetic question. The question is this. First of all, there are two possible reasons why the conductors of Monteux's generation, and there were quite a few. There was Toscanini, there was Kusevitsky, there was Bruno Walter. They were all around at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Ernest Ansermet, and they all lived into the LP era. Toscanini, for heaven's sake, they made it. They made it into the 50s, and they made recordings on LPs so that we know what things sounded like, and very, very good sound. And they know what the orchestras they were used to sounded like versus the ones that they trained. They actually trained and certified as representative of their best work. And there's no difference from what they did to what an orchestra sounds like now. There isn't any. Zero. Zippo. Might there have been differences in performance techniques? Sure. Might there have been differences in choice of instruments? Sure. But did those matter? No, they didn't matter at all. And to the extent they did matter, all of these conductors were more than happy to go with the modern sound. And the period instrument movement has no answer for this. There is this enormous elephant in the room, and the elephant is Maître Monteux and his colleagues. They say nothing about these people. Absolutely nothing. They just tell us that what they're doing is correct, or they can document that certain players had certain types of instruments or may have done something on the day. But does it make a difference musically in terms of the significance of the interpretation, or is it important enough that we need to care? Well, the answer is hell no, it isn't. It doesn't make any difference at all. The choice of instruments doesn't make the performance. The choice of instruments doesn't make the music. The playing technique of those instruments is absolutely irrelevant to what makes a successful interpretation. And we have the living proof. And it's the living proof that the period instrument people studiously ignore. And it's embarrassing because conductors like Monteux, he was a fabulous trainer. He had students. He had a school up in Hancock, Maine, and everybody came to him and studied with him and learned from him. And some of those people went on to be fabulous conductors themselves. And you don't see a lot of those people saying, oh, well, what Le Maître said was wrong because now I know the true way to perform Le Maître's répertoire. No, they don't usually do that because he had the pedigree. I mean, just think about it. Somebody born in 1875 who was trained, he was 25 years old when 1900 hit. So he was already essentially an adult performer at that age. And that was his period, 1875. Now, go back another 50 years to 1825. Beethoven was still alive. Well, think about that for a moment, would you? I mean, Beethoven was still alive. Schubert was still alive. Haydn was only recently dead. Mendelssohn was chugging out his first masterpieces. This is not a long time. One of the great scandals in the entire period instrument movement is the way that they are deceptive and play fast and loose with periodicity, with the idea that, well, every few years the whole concept of orchestral sonority must have changed. But there isn't any evidence for that. There's no evidence for that at all. Monteux was born less than 50 years after the death of Beethoven, and he grew up in a population of musicians who might have known Beethoven. And he grew up in a tradition, that of the Paris Conservatoire, the Paris Conservatory Orchestra, which was founded in order to play Beethoven. And that was the style that he knew that went back to Francois Habeneck, who founded that orchestra in the 1820s to perform Beethoven symphonies. And Monteux lived to the 1960s playing Beethoven symphonies, presumably in keeping with the tradition that he had been taught when he was a youth. Now, it really is fascinating. We think of it ourselves, oh, well, goodness, it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's such a long time. It's not. It's not a long time. It's literally the blink of an eye, historically. And that's what makes all of this period instrument schmagegginess so ridiculous, because what these people are trying to do, and what Monteux's example proves to be so utterly, ridiculously, completely false, they are trying to take tiny, tiny, insignificant differences in perhaps the mechanics of instrument construction or some form of playing technique of something or other and make a huge deal out of it. They're trying to claim deep, profound significance for every trivial, useless, irrelevant bit of pseudo-scholarly trash that they unearth. That's what they're doing. It's really very, very simple because we have the evidence. We have the evidence. Maître Monteux gives us the evidence. We know what the Franck Symphony sounded like in 1888. It sounded like what Pierre Monteux did when he recorded it in 1961 in glorious stereo at the Chicago Symphony. We know what these pieces sounded like. And that is one of the great scandals, I believe, in our modern musical life. The existence of these people running around, posing as experts, when the evidence of the actual people who were physically there and lived to transmit the fruits of their expertise to us, that evidence is right in front of us. It's absolutely in front of us. It's even more demented if you look at the scholarship of period instrument performance, because there are people out there who have written books analyzing the sound of historical recordings. And I remember talking to one of these soi-disant scholars in one of my own, scholarly episodes when I was dealing with these people. And I said to him, okay, fine. So you've got this horrible sounding recording from 1920 something where you basically can't hear anything with any kind of clarity, but you have the same music played by conductors who were alive then that was recorded in stereo, and it sounds perfectly normal. So why are you wasting time wondering what something sounded like in crappy sound in 1925 when you can hear it in fabulous sound in 1955? And of course, there was no answer. Well, the playing technique changed, and, there may have been a different style. What do you mean they've changed? Don't give me any crap. I mean, it's just nonsense. So I think Pierre Monteux, first of all, he was just a tremendously great conductor, a true musician down to his fingertips. I mean, he led many, many different orchestras and gave interpretations that were effortlessly organic and cohesive and beautiful in a number of works, a wide range of repertoire. But more to the point, his performances, his interpretations are authentic, truly authentic, because he was there. He knew these people. He knew these composers. He knew what they wanted. He knew what the expectations were. He knew what the proper sound should be. And he lived to tell us. And we have generations now of musicians who are just ignoring that evidence and pretending that they're the true experts, the people who have managed to be experts without ever having had the benefit of actually listening. And that's one of the demented things about the music industry, is that, I've said this before, people would much rather talk about it than actually listen to it. Music generally. And this whole scholarship on period instrument is all based on the idea that we can learn more about what music should sound like from treatises and verbal descriptions of things now and then, and possibly what we can reconstruct of the awful conditions that existed back in the day. They would much rather do that than pay attention to the people who were actually there and who lived long enough to tell us what actually it must have sounded like, because they knew. And think about it for a minute. Let's extrapolate backwards. If Pierre Monteux could be born in 1875 and live till 1964, almost 100 years later, and make stereo recordings of his core repertoire from the very beginning of the 20th century, and we don't hear that huge a difference, how huge a difference do you think it would have been for somebody who was coming of age in the 1870s, who was born in the 1840s? Or the 1830s or the 1820s. It's only a couple generations back. You have a few musicians, some of them live into their 70s or 80s or 90s. Think about it. If Pierre Monteux had lived to be trained by a musician who managed to make it into their 70s or 80s, and a lot of them did when he was a teenager, so in the 1880s, somewhere in there, that musician would have been born when Beethoven and Schubert were still around. Even Haydn was still around and was trained in that aesthetic. So assuming that pedigree matters, that people pass along these performance traditions, we're not talking about much at all. And we're not talking about huge differences. And if there are differences, the similarities are vastly more important than the differences. And this is what I think Monteux teaches us. So I urge you, if you are not a Classics Today subscriber, to consider subscribing, and then hop on over to classicstoday.com and have a look at the video on Pierre Monteux's 10 best recordings and listen to them with a keen ear for what they're telling us about what great musicianship has always been consistently throughout the generations, and what the true timbres and approach to this music really ought to be. And Monteux, like I said, isn't the only example. We have dozens of them. Quite a few. I made a list of 50 conductors who were born in the 19th century and who lived to make long-playing recordings. It's not like this is rare or that he's an exception. He's not. He's the rule. He's one of the older versions of the rule, but it's still the rule. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy Monteux's 10 Best Recordings. Bye-bye.